It's been a couple days now, and I'm still trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that my new boss is a White Sox fan. We do know the new pope, though, is all for the weary and downtrodden, though, we can say. Has been certainly exciting couple days here, having our new pope and one first American pope and being born just in our backyard. I'm sure you've seen a number of memes going around. I've been deleted my Twitter X account, so I appreciate a lot of friends sending me different ones. Here's a couple. Nice that we have a pope who also had to wait in line at the DMV for a real ID. It's one with Pope Leo up on the balcony there in the Vatican, reading there his first address with a caption, Pope Leo declares all pizza now Chicago style pizza. I have a list like 15 others here, but we better get on with the homily. But it being Good Shepherd Sunday, it is a good fitting Sunday, the first time we come together as a community to remember to be praying for our new shepherd, Pope Leo XIV. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the name Jordan Peterson, kind of a famous psychologist, Canadian, over the last maybe close to a decade now. But his wife, Tammy Peterson, she made news a little bit over a year ago as she shared that after a long journey with suffering and searching and wrestling, she entered the Catholic Church. She became Catholic. And she now has her own YouTube channel, her own podcast. And she, not too long ago, interviewed Bishop Robert Barron. And as she started off the interview, she asked Bishop Barron if she could begin by reading Jeremiah 15:16. So she begins and she reads, "Your words were found, and I ate them. And your words became for me a joy." At this point, she paused, she holds her chest as she starts to cry, gathers herself and continues, "And a delight to my heart, for I have been called by your name, O Lord God of hosts." And she looks up at Bishop Barron then and says, "I just wanted to say, I'm very grateful that Jesus called my name. And I can tell you why. Because cynicism called my name. Self-doubt called my name. Unforgiveness called my name. And they rarely call me anymore. I can't say that they don't call me," she said, "but they rarely call me now. And if they do, I just pray. And I find myself in a better place, and then they eventually disappear." Last week, I asked you to take home the back of the worship aid that had a list of those 7 wounds. We've been talking about wounds the last number of weeks, kind of those 7 common wounds, and take that worship aid home to have a heart-to-heart conversation with Jesus. Perhaps a heart-to-heart conversation with him next to your charcoal fire, that thing or that event where the enemy began to maybe whisper lies, and perhaps it's created a dark narrative in our lives. And we've been living in that spot, maybe even taken part of that, some of our identity with that, attached our identity to it. In the gospel today, in Good Shepherd Sunday, it's just 3 short verses. And Jesus begins and he says, "My sheep hear my voice." That is not just a cute metaphor that we use to teach children. That is a core Christian belief that Jesus is alive and he speaks. And as his sheep, he says, "My sheep hear my voice." As his sheep, they're able, in the midst of all the other noises and voices, his sheep are able to hear his voice, discern it, and hear it. And then he goes on, and what we see from the gospel, he says, "My sheep hear my voice." Hearing his voice, we find life. We won't perish. We're lifted out of lies of darkness, maybe the dark narratives we've been talking about. And we become unburdened. He uses the image then next. He says, it's like someone who's secure in the Father's hand, but unburdened. You saw that with Tammy Peterson. Cynicism called my name. Self-doubt called my name. Unforgiveness called my name. Can you hear the voice of the enemy? Can you hear whatever, who knows what wounds Tammy Peterson had, but can you hear the lies from the enemy? The dark narrative and maybe in which that she is especially susceptible to? I don't know, for Tammy Peterson. And can you see the voice that burdens her? And can you hear how she was unburdened when she put her hands over her chest and began to start crying? That I began to hear his voice. She heard another voice, one in which shined light upon the dark narrative. She says, they don't call me anymore. Why? She says, I pray. In other words, she hears another voice, a voice deep within her soul, a voice that unburdens her. I can't tell you the number of times I've sat across from somebody, whether they've come into my office or it's the confessional, but someone's come in who's confused, they're anxious, they're ashamed, and I just say the smallest, most simple word or phrase. Say, yeah, clear, like here's what I see happening clearly, like this is not from God. This narrative here or this voice, not from, you just see them just become unburdened. Light breaks in. Truth, you see truth just unburdens them. There's a priest buddy of mine, he was telling me a story of a flight that he was on. He had an aisle seat, and across the aisle was a young man, and that young man sitting across the aisle saw that he was a priest, saw his collar, and says, "Are you a Catholic priest?" And he goes, "Yes." "Can I ask you a question?" "Sure." "What do you think of suicide?" And the priest pointed out to the young man that when he ministers to families of suicide, he tells them often that when, similar to like when someone dies of cancer, in the obituary, you'll see, Susie, after a 5 or 6 year long battle with cancer, the cancer took her life. And he says, so it is fair to say that someone who takes their life, maybe like after a 10 or 15 year battle and struggle with depression, the man was suffering in ways in which nobody saw. It can take one's life similar to the way cancer does. And he gave the church's teaching and how we're to hope and pray just like anybody else for their salvation. The young man was just quiet. And tears filled his eyes. And he said, "When I was 17, my mom took her own life." Something that young man has been carrying alone for years. You can hear and just feel the shame, the confusion in the young man that was unburdened in him. The priest said at the end of the conversation, he said across the aisle, he just remembers the young man just looking at him with a look of love. He just looked at the priest with love because he was unburdened. Light came in a dark narrative in which that it was in, and the enemy began at least to undo a hold or a grasp that was on part of this guy's heart. In other words, he heard another voice, and the truth broke in. St. Ignatius, in his rules for discernment, Rule 13, he describes the enemy as a false lover. What does a false lover do? A false lover wants to keep the relationship that shouldn't be wants to keep it in secret. Don't have anyone know about it. Keep it under wraps. Keep it in the dark. St. Ignatius describes how the enemy, the devil, the evil one, wants to keep whispering lies and to keep it in the dark. Because when light is casted, when I hear the voice of the Good Shepherd, things begin to lift. Truth can come in. That's why Jesus says, my sheep hear my voice and they follow me. Do you hear his voice? Note that I'm not asking you if you believe in God. I'm asking you, do you hear his voice? Are you letting him speak to your heart? In the midst of the plethora of noises and voices in which we have all the time, are you giving him space, quiet, undistracted space to remind you who you are, to remind you whose you are? The question is, like, those of you that were here last week, did you have a heart-to-heart conversation with Jesus last week? I'm not talking about praying a Hail Mary before going to bed. I'm not talking about saying grace before a meal. I'm asking if this past week, did you have a heart-to-heart conversation with the living Jesus? Because quite honestly, it needs to happen every day. That's just the lifeline of Christianity. My sheep hear my voice. Make space for prayer. The devil knows how important it is to pray, how powerful it is when we hear the Father's voice. He knows how healing it is to hear that voice. So he'll do whatever it takes to get you to me not to pray. I stink at prayer. I don't know what to do at prayer. Like, it doesn't seem to ever work, or like, it's just, it seems like a useless thing with how busy I am and everything else. Even if it feels dry, even if it feels like you have no idea what the heck you're doing, show up. Show up. And let him speak. Because when you do, the promise is that he gives life. Things will begin to open up. I'll become unburdened. And as he says the promise, I'll be secure. And perhaps maybe a special word for anyone who's younger out there. Perhaps nobody more than you are you facing an incredible amount of different voices in which that's causing you to be insecure, not stable. Be secure. Roam free in green pastures. Hear his voice. Receive life. Know who you are and whose you are. In the midst of a plethora of other voices that are just grabbing for you. Because no lie, no wound, no shame can snatch you from him. Just briefly, just real quick, end with this. The first reading, we've been reading from the Acts of the Apostles these days of Easter, and we hear Paul and Barnabas today. These are two men, they know the shepherd's voice, and they don't keep it to themselves. They speak it out loud. They shine light into dark places. We see it even in the first reading. Why? Because people are hurting. People who are trapped in false stories and false narratives, dark narratives, just like that young man on the airplane, just like Tammy Peterson, and just like you and I tend to be. There are people all around us, all around you, coworkers, friends at school, whether it's high school, junior high, college, neighbors, who are maybe carrying silent grief. They're carrying hidden wounds, secret wounds, listening to the lies of the enemy, and they're burdened. They're burdened. And they're waiting for someone to introduce them to another voice, the Good Shepherd's voice. And requires us to first hear his voice. The sheep hear his voice. Do you hear his voice? Pray. Hear him. Hear his voice. Roam free in green pastures. Be secure in his hand. Be unburdened. And then unburden others by letting them hear the shepherd's voice.